Thank you for that introduction, Frank, and thank you, all of you for being here today. I'm very excited to be here. I'm honored to be part of the Zube lecture series, and I'm really happy to be here. It's my first time in Amherst, and so far I'm very impressed. You all are very fortunate to have a beautiful campus with it's a laboratory of landscape architecture and architecture. This building that you have and the studios that I saw today are just fantastic. The rain garden that's right outside the window right there. I mean, this building and the grounds are a laboratory themselves. It was great to meet some of the students today. There's a really positive energy up there in the studio, so it seems like a really great place to be a student right now. I'm going to talk to you today about photomontage and a specific type of photomontage called eidetic photomontage, which is really about idea generation, a conceptual type of photomontage. And as Frank mentioned in my introduction, I really have three areas of focus in my research and teaching. One is brownfield visioning and redevelopment. My students work with communities, mostly kind of in the Great Plains, but also outside of that, in other parts of the country. Creative thinking and design. I'm very interested in creative processes, the design process, and how we can apply that in landscape architecture and other design fields. And photomontage as a visual agent for creative thinking, both for generating ideas, but also for communicating. And so on the right side of the screen, you can see the outline for today's presentation. I'm going to start off by talking about creativity, just kind of a background. I'll talk a little bit about the class I teach on creativity, and then talk about how that connects with photomontage. And I'll talk about three specific stages of the creative design process: preparation, incubation, and insight. And talk about how specific approaches to photomontage can assist you in each of those three phases. And I'll support that with a lot of student work, a couple examples of my own work. And then at the end, I will talk about AI and image generation and AI. And it's very early in the development of AI and the introduction and the adoption of AI. So what I'm going to talk about might be more speculations, but it is coming and it's important. And so I think it's important that we, as landscape architects and other designers, are considering what this means. Okay, so I'll start off chapter 1, the creative process. This is my class, Unlocking Creativity. It is open to anyone in the university. It's probably usually a majority of design students in there. We have industrial design, interior architecture, architecture planning, and landscape architecture in our college. But I also end up with students from like vet med and business and education. And so there are a really diverse set of voices to think about what creativity means, because it means something different for a music major than it does for a business major. In the class, I touch on the work from a lot of researchers, a lot of innovators who've started firms like the Kelly brothers there. They started IDEO, which is a global innovation and design firm, as well as authors like Elizabeth Gilbert, and draw from their definitions of creativity so that the students can form their own definition. So this is a class that's really about reflection and self-growth more than it is about telling anyone what to think. So we look at the work of some of the greatest or most recognized creative thinkers in history. We talk about creative processes, again, so that students can really recognize their own process and develop and enhance their own creative process. I talk about different ways of thinking. Divergent thinking, meaning lots and lots of different ideas. Convergent thinking is narrowing it down to the best ideas out of those. Lateral thinking, being stepping outside of the problem and being able to look at it differently and maybe completely reframing the problem. Aesthetic thinking, so this would be like visual artists, how they creatively work with image. And then emergent thinking, which Mozart was famous for writing about, how he could compose an entire piece in his mind before he ever wrote a note. So he could, the process of his creativity was much more when he was walking or riding in a carriage, he would say. Important themes for the semester include overcoming blocks, types of constraints, like external constraints being bitter, or learning from some creative artists like the White Stripes, who create they create constraints for themselves in order to become more creative. You will only see red, white, and black in their promos, for example, and all of their marketing materials, and their branding. We talked about methods of working, both individually and in groups, and the importance of drawing, meditation, and nature in terms of creativity. And we do a lot of work in class, so we meditate in class, we go out into nature, we do kind of immersive types of exercises. So every class period, there's something going on. It's not just me lecturing, there's a lot of activity. Students do a lot of thinking. They do a creativity journal they turn in each week with 5 entries. Again, focusing on their own creative development, because I really have one main learning objective for this class, and that's for every student to walk out more creative than they walked in. So it's really focused on that. So out of all of this, there has been one creative process that has emerged as the one that I'm most drawn to, that resonates with me, and that's by this guy. You can try to say his name, but I'll tell you. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. Doesn't look like that. It's pronounced Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. He's a psychologist who studied creativity for many years. He also wrote a book called Flow, which also was very popular in addition to this book, Creativity. But he talks about creativity occurring in 5 phases: preparation, incubation, insight, evaluation, and elaboration. Preparation is the stage where you immerse yourself in the problem, where you learn as much as you can in a variety of different ways. For landscape architects, this might mean going out to the site, maybe spending multiple visits out in the site, watching people, observing the patterns of plants and wildlife, immersing yourself in the history of a place, going back to maybe archival documents to see what the place was before it was today, probably sketching, mapping, and also community engagement, learning from people who have their own stories about a place, and then hopefully developing a narrative around that, or multiple narratives. The next phase, and this is one of the reasons I'm drawn to this particular model of creative process, is the stage called incubation, also often called rumination. And it is the subconscious process of working on the problem without trying to work on the problem. It's going on in the back of your mind. It happens when you're walking your dog, it happens when you're in the shower, when you're preparing a meal, when you're not actively working on the problem, but your subconscious is processing it still. And I think it's often left out of the creative process discussion because it's not something that, it's not as easy to define. It's not like your studio professor is going to say, okay, now go ruminate now. They're not going to tell you to do that necessarily, but hopefully you are doing it. And so really, this one for me is about metacognition and just understanding that thinking process is happening in the background. Insight. This is kind of the eureka moment. This is where all the pieces come together after the preparation and after the rumination. Sometimes it's not one specific moment, sometimes it unfolds, but it's when the pieces are coming together and you can begin to see how this design resolution can take shape. After that is time for evaluation. So this is putting the idea in front of other people and testing it and getting feedback. Is the idea valuable? If so, how? In what ways? Is it novel? Is it unique? And so bringing the idea to test it, to validate it. And then finally, the final stage is what, famously Thomas Edison said that genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. So elaboration is that 99% perspiration, that once the idea has sort of solidified, it's all of the hard work required to bring that idea into reality, whether it's in your studio, just getting to the end and having fine details and having it all work together, having it respond to the community, or in professional practice, having it built, realizing a project. So the elaboration stage can take a very long time, but it is the kind of last stage of the creative process. Then, of course, all of these 5 steps are kind of mixed up. It's not quite so neat as these little boxes suggest, that there's always feedback loops happening, and you're always learning as you go through the process. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about photomontage as a visual agent for creativity and expression. So a little background, I got interested in photomontage, and particularly this idea of eidetic photomontage or conceptual photomontage when I was in your shoes. When I was an MLA student, I was also a Master's of Urban Design student, and I was working on my thesis, and one part of my thesis was investigating the way that people think about landscape. So conventional paradigms of landscape. And one that I identified was thinking about landscape as a peripheral scenic object. The word landscape in English, you look it up in the dictionary, one of the origins is landscape painting. And so in English, landscape is very much connected to a peripheral scenic object, something you look at from a distance and observe. The second paradigm was landscape as a social instrument. In other words, an object that you can use to define an edge between one property and the next, or placing something in a particular location so that it has some agency. And then the last is landscape as an ecological asset, so timber, agriculture, mining, and even recreation. So what capital benefits does it provide? So I was talking about all these concepts and writing about them, but I'm a very visual person. So finally one day I just set all that aside and got out Photoshop, opened Photoshop, and made this photomontage. And it helped me a lot to understand the ideas that I was thinking about, and I could also communicate them to other people a lot more easily just by having this image. So this really stuck with me. It didn't change the course of my thesis. I used it as a way to talk about it, but I continued on with that. But then when I moved, I went back into professional practice, and then when I moved back into academia, I was asked very early in my career, like the first, month I was there or something, to give a lecture about something. The dean asked me to do it. I was like, oh, dean asked, I better do it. And so I created a lecture about photomontage, and then it rekindled my interest, and I started researching it. I did a series of presentations at conferences, collaborated with some other folks, and ended up writing a journal article in Landscape Journal called Situating Eidetic Photomontage in Contemporary Landscape Architecture. And in this article, we traced the origins of photomontage back to the Dada artists. So the Dada artists were working around the time of World War I, and they were experimenting with images like this, of taking photographic images or pieces of artwork and combining them to create an image that has a specific meaning, it has a purpose. And they deliberately didn't call it collage, they called it photomontage because they saw their work as being different from just the compositional aesthetic of collage. They saw their work as having a message. So many of the Dada artists had a political agenda that they were pushing, and so their work wasn't meant to be an artifact hung on the wall, but rather to help people think differently. And as they said, connect art to life. In the 60s, a number of architecture offices, particularly Archigram and Superstudio, appropriated these techniques into their speculative architecture designs. So like this is one on the left. It's they call it the airship, and it would be like bringing architecture to a city and just like dropping architecture in. And so they used photomontage as a technique, drawing from the work of the Dada artists. And so that has continued. The image on the right is from Grossmax, which is a landscape architecture firm in Edinburgh, who relies heavily on this technique. We also see James Corner using this in competitions, and Balmori on the right using it as well. So a lot of offices have appropriated this today, and it's still a very common approach to communicating ideas conceptually. So no one thinks it's going to look exactly like this. No one thinks that guy is going to be translucent or that flowers are going to be this big, but it's about communicating ideas. And so in the article, we identify 7 cues, or if you're creating it, strategies for creating eidetic photomontage so that it stands out from, it won't be confused with a photographic, photorealistic photomontage. Typically, those come at the end of a project to communicate, hey, this is what it's going to look like. So again, having more of an aesthetic quality and not so much of an ideation quality. And so the big takeaway from that article is the quote at the bottom: the value of eidetic photomontage is both its capacity to communicate conceptual and abstract aspects of design, and its agency to nurture new forms of thought, creativity, and imagination. So for the remainder of the talk, I'm going to talk about the first 3 phases of the design process: preparation, incubation, and insight, and speak specifically to how different forms of eidetic photomontage can help you in each of those phases. And I'm going to use a lot of student work to do that, starting with preparation. So this is a competition that was a couple years ago called Street City Vietnam. The challenge was for the competitors to come up with a new model for a street market in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam, that could be inspired by and reference some of the historic models of street markets. So the first task that my colleague and I assigned our students was to do a narrative photomontage, to start to understand the history and or current conditions that exist in Ho Chi Minh City. And so students did things like this, looking at, so this is Anna Rader. She looked at kind of the juxtaposition of the environmental conditions of the past versus the present, the temple versus the skyscrapers, methods of food collection like fishing. How does the fish get to the market? How are they caught? So there are traditional methods of that. And then also thinking about how livestock were brought to the market and juxtaposing that against maybe a contemporary market stand. Emily was interested in tracing the history and culture of bicycles and motorbikes, because that is a primary form of transportation in Ho Chi Minh City. And she kind of explored that in a variety of ways, including it's hard to tell in this image, but this was actually a 3-dimensional model that she created of a motorbike with this giant bag, because you see images of people loading up their motorbikes with fruit and vegetables to take to the market. So that became a kind of driving narrative that she was interested in. Another competition that my colleague and I led our students through was called Renature Rome, and this competition was focused on increasing or enhancing biodiversity in Rome. So a similar process, the students went through a series of narrative photomontages to immerse themselves in the problem and learn about the context that they were working within. So this student, also named Emily, looked at the history of Rome in 5 epochs. So this is a highly condensed history of Rome, but looking at the ancient Rome, medieval, Renaissance, Industrial Revolution, and then she also sort of sketches out through this image a kind of hopeful future. Another Emily looked at the baths of Caracalla. We have other names. And the baths of Caracalla, which at one time was the most lavish, outside of the emperor's palace probably, lavish places in Rome, a place of luxury that when the Western Roman Empire fell into ruin, was overtaken by wilderness, and some people started to farm there. And now today it's mostly fenced off, and it's a tourist site. It's kind of a static tourist site that people can take photos of, but it's not a bath anymore. Blaine looked at the Aurelian walls. That's one of the layers of walls around Rome that was built for fortification, and kind of traced the use of these walls and its occupation and the types of entry control that they exercised over time. Charling looked at this phenomenon of sinkholes that occurs in Rome, which when she first proposed that, I raised my eyebrows, but she took this project in some very interesting directions, partly because of the mapping she did and this photo montage exploring what that means. The sinkholes, some of them look like little potholes, some of them swallow cars, and one of them even swallowed a building. So they're a significant issue that Rome is facing. And Julia looked at the disparity between wealth and poverty along the Tiber River, where some of the wealthiest people spend their time, and also some of the most impoverished and unhoused populations as well. Next stage, incubation. Now this one, like I said, your studio professor doesn't go tell you to ruminate or incubate. Like, no, you have to kind of do that, and it's good to be aware you're doing it. But I kind of tried to do that in a class. So K-State, where I teach, we have a very strong Italian studies program where we have a permanent facility in Orvieto, Rome, which is located between Rome and Florence. And Orvieto, we have a studio there, and we send faculty and students, our faculty and our students there, summer, fall, and spring. And spring is the big one. Like I've taught there twice. We have around 50 students who go. And it's a mix of different disciplines. And each professor teaches a studio and a seminar. And so the seminar I taught was focused on photomontage, and I wanted to focus on narrative. So it was not connected to studio. So they could do work and be ruminating about studio at the same time. And what I asked them to do was to photograph their experiences, because this is kind of a once-in-a-lifetime experience, to spend 4 months in Italy, and to document those through photographs and then create analog image transfers into photomontages. And actually, I brought some for you guys to check out, because it doesn't really do them justice to look at them on the screen, because these things are super cool. They're made in a variety of different ways, but most of them are created using solvents, like acetone or xylene, to transfer printed images onto another surface, another medium. And so the intent here is to each week document some experience they've had that week. So every Wednesday we'd have a pinup, and they had to produce at least one of these. And they didn't know what they were doing. When I started teaching this class, I didn't know what I was doing either. So we were all kind of learning together. And the intent was that over this period of 8 weeks, they would gain a lot of skill in composition, a lot of skill in the physical act of transferring images. And one of the constraints that we have, I think it's important to point out, is in Italy, we don't have plotters. We don't have desktop computers. So if people bring a laptop, they have a computer or an iPad, but we don't have a lot of technology there. So all of our final drawings and posters, everything is drawn by hand and now image transfer. So it's important to point out that they're in a kind of different setting than they're used to. No 3D printers, no laser cutters, no CNC routers, none of that stuff. But also importantly, during these first 8 weeks, I did create a safe to fail environment, meaning as long as they produced at least one of these, they were getting an A. So they didn't have to worry about doing a bad job. They could take risks, they could experiment. As long as they were producing, they were getting an A. So they took the whole worry about grades out of the discussion, so they could just work and be free and artistic and take chances. And honestly, they produced way better work in a way shorter amount of time than I expected, both times. This is an example of our pinups, our Wednesday pinup. We would tape our work on the walls outside the classroom at a palace that was next door to our studio. If it was nice out, if not, we'd be inside the studio. But we were learning from each other. The students were teaching each other. They would learn something and they'd share it. So it was a very collaborative working environment. So in that project, I was giving the students space to ruminate on their studio project while they were reflecting on their own personal experiences. So that was my way of helping them to accomplish that second stage of the design process. And so the third stage, insight, that's the moment where all the pieces begin to come together, or at least we start to form ideas. And so I encourage my students to start creating in studio classes, in this case it's a master's project, to start experimenting with eidetic photomontage very early in the process, when they're still, before they even know what they're designing, perhaps. In this case, Jared was just at the earliest stages of doing some mapping for an urban design project, and he started making compositions like this to investigate how he could improve the circulation systems of a commuter rail, a street, a sidewalk, bike lanes. This bridge didn't look like this at all, but he was just kind of experimenting. He didn't take dimensions, he didn't worry about specifics, but just trying to visualize it. He also started visualizing what some of the spaces would how they would function, related between, for example, here, residential buildings and a community garden. And so this is the level of design he's at. He's like markers on trace. This is not at the end of the project. This is the very beginning, when he's just sketching things out. So you can think of these as a thought in formation, as Andrea Kahn coined that term. A thought in formation, and capturing that thought information graphically. Zach, working on the same master's project, he was using before and afters to start to think about, in this case, what a TOD could look like, while he was similarly developing his layouts with marker by hand, but also visualizing what's happening. So you see the difference here is that it's encouraging idea generation much earlier. We're not using this as a final product, but more as a milestone in thought development. Going back to the Rome competition, Charlie used this type of eidetic photo montage to start to conceptualize what the sinkholes could become in a variety of different ways. This student, Abigail, was looking at, she was interested in talking statues, which is a tradition in Rome where some statues the public can interact with, and they can ask questions or criticize the government, which has been going on for, I don't know, hundreds or 1,000 years with these talking statues. And she thought that was a good place to begin to introduce biodiversity into the city. So that's her photo montage to start to explore that. And then Julia, the student who was exploring disparity on the Tiber River, she leveraged there was a tourist cruise ship that would go on the Tiber River for very wealthy people that wasn't properly anchored and crashed and ran aground and has been sitting there for like 20 years and no one's doing anything with it. So her idea that she was exploring through this type of imagery was to convert that into a support system for the unhoused population, as well as a botanical garden. And then Emily, who was looking at the baths of Caracalla, imagined how the site could return to a public space like it once was, maybe not as lavish, but certainly conserve the population of both the tourists, but also the people who probably live in Rome, and provide them with not like the image over here where it's roped off and all you're allowed to do is look at it, but maybe it could become something that had the agency of what it once was in the beginning. And then this project was a student looking in Colorado, doing a simple analog manual collage at the same time that she was starting to cut cross sections. So again, very early in the process, just exploring programmatic adjacencies and ideas. All right, so that brings us to now. And sort of my initial thoughts about how image generators using artificial intelligence can help us. And what I've been using is Midjourney. How many of you guys have messed around with image generators in AI? Okay, a few of you. Midjourney or something else? Midjourney? All right, so not too many people yet. I haven't really used a lot of these image generators, but from what I have used, Midjourney, at least in my experience, is far and away better than the others. You have way more control. The image quality is much higher, and you get better results. You use it through Discord, so there's an interface in Discord where it basically runs a bot. You type in prompts into like the chat box, and it creates these images. And you can control a lot, like the proportions of the drawing. By default, it goes in the square, but you can make them any proportion you want. You can control the graphic style, so you could say, make it look like anime, make it look like a cartoon, make it look like a comic book, make it look like a painting by Picasso, and it will do that. It's really amazing. And so you can control time of day, lighting, all kinds of things. And then also interestingly, you can give it a URL to a photograph, and it will start from that photograph or use that photograph in image creation. And so I see promise in a few different ways for AI. I also see some, maybe not risks, but areas that we should all be paying attention to as this moves forward. So I have the prompt at the bottom, so you can see what I typed in and what came out. And what it does is it gives you 4 images, and those are 4 versions of how it responds to that prompt. So on the left, landscape architecture plan rendering of urban park, water feature, trees, colorful, paving, and stage. So 4 pretty different options, but they all kind of respond to that prompt. And then on the right, you can see the prompt, but it was really focused on a playground and involving certain features or certain programmatic elements. And so I see this as a good, in the creative process, very early, as a way to start exploring ideas. It's not that different, I don't think, from a precedent study, where you're looking at a built work in a precedent study and analyzing it and maybe identifying what could be transferable from that precedent into your project. This is kind of the same, except maybe you can guide the image creation a little bit more than you could with the precedent study. So there's value there, and then you also have the ability within Midjourney to choose one of those images and create variations of that. So you can say, I like this one the most, make 4 that build off of that. So you can kind of keep going with, you can keep going forever with it. And so then it allows for a certain level of exploration. Now keep in mind, these are placeless. They're not responding to any site conditions. They're not responding to any community engagement. They're not responding to any specific program outside of what you put in the prompt. So they're placeless. And everything that we do in landscape architecture and planning and architecture is really place-based. And we have to respond to that. So we need to remember that this is just pixels. You can also put it in, you can request a certain style. So there's a photomontage artist who is a Mexican architect named Tatiana Bilbao, and her work is this very artistic collage style photomontage that I really admire. So I asked Midjourney to make something in her style, and it did. This is her style. You get some kind of goofy things, like I used this on the title slide, this image here, but here's a bird with its wings folded up, almost like it's sitting on a branch, but it's floating up in the air. In this world, there's a moon and a sun, and the moon is bigger than the sun. So that, you get some strange things that come out of Midjourney AI sometimes, and those are loosely referred to as hallucinations in the AI world, and it means that we need to remain critical. We can make plans. So I see value here as maybe giving you ideas for a rendering style or a color palette. Again, these are placeless. They're not responding to contours or soil types or hydrology or anything. But I think they could have some value in terms of visual stimuli or visual points of departure. Another area that I think we could use this is for the entourage that we use in our Photoshop-based photomontages. So you can ask for it to create a just blank background or white background, so it's really easy to crop. You don't have to go in and crop things out anymore. I know that a lot of people use like the PNG warehouses now where it's already pre-cropped, and that's pretty handy. But some of those you have to pay for. So, like I think Mr. Cut It, you're only allowed to take 5 a day unless you pay for it. And also, you get what's there. With this, you can tell it exactly what you want. You can say, if you're trying to make a rendering in winter time, you have them wearing winter clothes. And you can talk about facial expressions, body language, activity, so what they're doing, the right, it's realistic men and women walking in professional clothing and laughing. So if you're trying to show a maybe downtown scene of a big city, these could be used. And so I think this is valuable in a few ways. One is, I'm sure many of you have noticed that from firms across the world, you see the same scale figures over and over and over and over. It'd be nice to just see some renderings without that one lady walking with her kid.
Yes.
Come on. And so you can put in like lady walking with a kid in here and get a million different ones. Also, these are not real people. These are fabricated people. So there's no model release required. There's no photographer rights. They're royalty free because of the agreement that Midjourney uses. So you can use these. You don't have to worry about especially when you start talking about populations under 18 of age, because they have a whole different set of restrictions. And I know that that stuff is out there like crazy, but this starts to address some of those ethical concerns. Same with plants, One of my biggest pet peeves is when you see a rendering that has the same exact tree repeated over and over and over on the same drawing, and it looks, I don't know, it's very disturbing, it looks super unnatural, and it's very distracting, I think, from the overall composition. So here you can very easily create a variety of different trees that you could put in and create a much more natural looking composition. But you do get some weird things like Tilia cordata, 15 years old, with that's a bonsai. Where did that come from? So that's probably another example of a hallucination, and we have to remain critical. We can't just accept everything that this spits out at us. Some of you may have guessed by now, as I'm talking through this, that all of those images that I showed you during the 5 stages of the creative process, I created in Photoshop using images that I generated in Midjourney. So I think this is an area where there is tremendous potential for the design disciplines, is not just using what it spits out at us, but creating something out of our own work through our own vision using components that we can very deliberately and specifically choose. So each of these were created by me. Oh, and then this one, kind of the opposite of the bonsai, is I asked it to create a scene full of brilliant, beautiful ideas. I was not expecting a magical forest, but when I got a magical forest, I was like, wow, that actually could be really cool. He's kind of walking from his banal craftsman era neighborhood into this magical forest. So, there's opportunities. We have to remain critical and look out for the bonsais, but we should remain open to the magical forests. And in teaching eidetic photomontage, I strongly encourage you to not throw every image at a single composition. 3 to 5. 3 to 5 images. Catherine D has an article where she calls this candy store aesthetics. So you see these renderings, these photomontage renderings where there's like 20 elements like plastered all over the place, and it's overwhelming and you can't even keep track of what's happening. So I suggest 3 to 5. Don't exceed 5. But there are some other things we have to be paying attention to when we're making this kind of work. What's in common with all of these scale figures?
They're all white.
They're all white. And not because I asked for white people, but because it's drawing from the billions of images that are across the internet, and this is what it kicks out. For this one, I asked for a diverse group of college students looking at a map, and that's what it gave me, a diverse set of college students. So we have to be very attentive to what this is spitting out to us. We have to be aware of what it means. We have to be aware of what it means to the people that we're presenting to. If we're presenting this to a community and what we're showing them is a representative of the population of that community, then we are missing our job. We're not doing our job. Also, we have to be careful of age, because if you use the word professor, this is what you get. Like a 7-year-old guy with a big white beard, like we're not all 70 with a beard. I mean, we got this guy. He's neither 70 and he doesn't have a beard. Which brings me to the final point that I'd like to make about AI, which is you can use a photo of a person to make an image. And I happen to know that Frank likes Italian gardens. It's not perfect. It's not exactly Frank, but it's pretty close. And he's in a fictitious Italian garden. So you can do this. So if there's a particular character or
Be careful.
yeah, be careful. Yeah, be careful with this. This could be dangerous. You know, if there, particularly if you know there's a particular champion of the project that you're working with, the mayor of the city, or someone who maybe you want to include in a photo montage, you're able to do that if you have a photo of them. So I encourage you to try these techniques out, whether you're using analog methods like got passed around the room, or digital photo montage, or experimenting with AI. I assert that eidetic photo montage can help you in the preparation, incubation, and insight of your creative process. So I'm open to questions. Do we have time for questions?
Yeah.
Does anyone have questions? Yes.
So why would we dare use AI in landscape architecture and urban planning? It just doesn't make sense to me.
What about it doesn't make sense after listening to this?
What doesn't make sense is that we ask for generated pictures of landscape, and then they don't give you like the exact look of a real landscape like this one, or like when you ask for a person, when you ask when you say, oh, ask for a professor pointing at a wall, it gives out that stereotypical picture. How ridiculous.
Yeah, and that's where you have to be critical, and you can modify the search. So in order to get, should we stay here for a minute? In order to get this professor, I put in a 40-year-old stylish professor. So we picked out a different. So we have to, be aware of the prompts, be aware of what you're doing. This is by no means. I mean, I'm not necessarily an advocate for AI for everything. Absolutely not. But I do think it offers potential for us in the creative process, especially in the beginning. It's not place specific, which is very important to landscape architecture and urban design. You can think about ways to make it place specific, like maybe use a background photo of the place in which you're working, and then you can collage in some other elements.
So really thought of it, I'd rather be drawing it out on paper.
Yeah, and absolutely, AI is not for everybody. Absolutely, like we should not be walking away from being able to draw, being able to use all of the analog tools that have been developed over thousands of years. Like those are still valuable. I do also see that AI has some potential, especially with the conceptualization of ideas. Other questions? Yeah.
Are there any concerns in the profession about AI being original or authentic when creating out plans and such?
Yes, there are a lot of concerns about AI. So there was a webinar 2 weeks ago that LAF sponsored, and the webinar had 3 panelists one was a practitioner, one was a researcher, and one was an educator, and they were all focused on AI and landscape architecture. And it was really fascinating to listen to what they had to say. And I'd already pretty much done all of this, so I was like, uh-oh, I'm gonna have to start over. But they did definitely reinforce some of the same concepts that I talked about. They dove deeply into the ethics that you're talking about. One question that was a concern, is this going to replace landscape architects? Are we going to need landscape architects in the future? And that was a resounding no. It's not going to replace landscape architects. They didn't make this analogy, but the camera didn't replace landscape painters. The calculator didn't replace mathematicians. It's definitely a very emerging topic in landscape architecture. At the end of the webinar, they invited everyone on the call to participate in a series of working groups and symposia, because this group, obviously, they're passionate about it, but beginning a dialogue so we can start to answer those types of really hard questions is important right now, because it's really starting to happen. It's gaining traction, and you can ignore it. As a discipline, we can ignore it. A lot of my colleagues in my building and also on other campuses across the country are really scared of it and really freaked out and just kind of sticking their head in the sand. And that's, I mean, that's a choice. You can do that, but what it's going to happen with or without, without embracing. It's a good question. Yeah.
You sort of touched on this already, but I would just like to hear you elaborate it on it a bit more. Do you find that you or other professionals sort of grapple with the moral ambiguity of your work being automated more often than not?
The ambiguity of our work. I'm sorry, that's lost.
Just the work of AI. How slippery of a slope, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, I'm only just beginning to use this in my studio. So this fall, my students for the first time will be using AI in their studio work. And we are working with a community. So we'll be kind of testing out some of those questions. Again, AI is it's not a silver bullet. It's not going to give you the answer, but it might help you to answer some questions that you have. And then you have to curate this stuff. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Other questions? Yeah, Frank.
Yeah, great presentation. I mean, to be honest, I mean, there is even bad design that doesn't respond to size without
AI.
Without AI. So just be
without the A or the I.
Right. It's not, neither. It's nothing. So I think and I was turned off by these kind of images that I was like, okay, well,
But not this one.
No. They're very kind of stereotyped. But I think it's also true you get what I found well, what's already out there? What's because if you begin design, you first begin, well, okay, let's do the easy solution now. Maybe well, what's out there, and then maybe you're gonna pick and evaluate. To say, wait, you will work only these people? No, maybe not. Okay, good. First point. How does it respond to size? Well, where? So I think the potential that this stuff is kind of raising up as questions, write down these questions, and then maybe that will help you to develop your design.
Yeah.
As like a creative instrument.
Yeah, it's another way to explore ideas. And it's interesting you use the word instrument because one of the panelists in that webinar, the LAF webinar a couple weeks ago, she described for her AI as both a tool and an instrument. That it's a tool like a hammer where you can use it to do a specific thing, a specific task, or explore or create a specific graphic. But she also sees it as an instrument like a violin that could be played by a master and can create masterful images valuable in certain ways if the master is experienced and knows how to use it. So I thought that was kind of interesting. It just triggered my memory of that when you used the word. But yes, going back to the stereotypical business people, you could easily use any keyword to create any kind of person that you want. Oh, also the other one is that I noticed on all of these is body type. Everybody is like a fit athlete. There's like a very singular body type that's being kicked out. And so I think we have to be aware of that as well. And gender, all kinds of biases that are, Midjourney is an algorithm. It doesn't have biases, but it's picking up on biases that are present on the data set that it's drawing from.
So it's actually, I think this is so provocative that it provokes questions.
Yeah.
Right? That dark, we're like these people, so what are the questions? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We can have dozens different questions just looking at the scene there.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. It's really, I think that's where we are with AI right now is we have, in landscape architecture, it's raising more questions than it's giving answers. Absolutely. So hopefully today this maybe gives some speculation, but certainly I don't really have any answers.
But I mean, I think questions are a good thing. Too.
Yeah, good.
So that's a great presentation, and I know that the Landscape Architecture Foundation webinar, I think, is available for people to
It is.
download and watch. So if people are interested in Landscape Architecture Foundation AI,
If you just Google LAF AI webinars.
to find it. So I think that's important for the questions. And I guess my question is more to do with the design imagery. Is there a concern when AI is grabbing images and grabbing someone else's image, and all of a sudden you find it in your rendering? So have you come across that, and what do you think about that from an ethical standpoint?
My understanding of how it works is it's grabbing from a massive collection of imagery, so you probably wouldn't see any one, authorship from any one person. That's my understanding, but it's possible that maybe, especially if you use in the style of field operations, in the style of, MBVA or whatever, you might start to see some of that, certainly. And are there questions about authorship? There are. The U.S. Copyright Office has reviewed some attempts to copyright AI. One person created a piece of artwork that they wouldn't copyright because they said it wasn't created by a person, and then someone else has succeeded in getting a comic book copyrighted that was created by AI. So questions about copyrighting this too. Now, I would say that something like, this, where I made this, created that in Photoshop using my own creative imagination, using fragments that were generated by AI. To me, this is a more clear-cut copyright situation. Like, I would have the copyright to that image, even though the fragments came from AI, whereas just this, I don't know. I don't think we really know. Yeah, who was the author? Yeah. Yes?
I'm curious in your classes, so you said that using AI is going to be a first for you with this. Okay.
Yeah, like right now.
So I was curious, talking about the creative process and everything, like what sort of more natural or naturally curated, creative, what am I trying to say? What ways that are more natural for your students to be more creative have you implemented in your classes? And the reason I'm bringing that up is because I find it interesting that so many people now need newness, and when we talk about doom scrolling on your phone, there's something new every 2 seconds that's stimulating your brain. And AI kind of acts the same way, where if instead you're out on a walk and or listening to a podcast that inspired you or something like that, kind of naturally curated creativity versus AI. I was curious what your opinion was on that.
Well, I make them go outside a lot in my landscape architecture classes, as well as my creativity class. They have assignments where they have to go out and, as an example, gather found objects and make artwork out of them. That's way back here. That's way back here. See the whole presentation. There we go. So these are all little art installations that the students have to do. And, I think that getting out of the phone, having tactile experiences is really, it's really, really important, because a lot of magic happens when you're not tied to your desk, staring at your screen. So I would say that, and just a lot of experimentation. I also, having students work in small groups on something that's completely unrelated to their studio project. So one exercise I like to do is, and then they don't know I'm going to do this, but then I'll put them into a group of other people from other times in history. So you might have Lawrence Halprin and choose anyone from history, sitting at the same table with Garrett Ekbo, and I'll give them some kind of prompt that they have to respond to, and they have to describe how they channeled, the interests and the beliefs and the value systems of that particular designer in this collaborative design project that they're all doing together, and talk about how they work together. And so in a way, it helps, because sometimes we get stuck in our creative process because we're really focused on ourselves. We have protective of our own egos and ourselves. But if we can channel someone else, sort of alleviates that tension. And also, it's a really good way to learn too, because if you're doing a Baroque design in the style of Versailles, or you might not otherwise do, you might learn some things. So good question. Any other questions? Yeah.
Do you ever use the generative fill tools in Photoshop, or are you only using the
Generative. Oh, I have used that.
Yeah.
So what he's, and I've only experimented with it. I haven't really done anything. But like in Photoshop, if you have an image that has a frame, it's this big, but you want to make it this big, Photoshop will expand and guess at what that should look like. Sometimes it's amazing. Like you can't even tell. Other times it's really weird. And the other AI tools in Photoshop are terrible. Like if you ask it to add trees to an image, they look abysmal. If you ask it to add people, they look like aliens. Like, I would, for the expanding, the autofill, I think there can be some applications for that. But that's, at least, I haven't used it too much, so as far as I can tell, that's about it. There's
Great.
probably.
So,
Have you ever done a group of people looking at something and then ask the AI to do the same thing? So you have student work and then you have AI work, sort of mixed those
No, I haven't done that yet. I know that is an approach, a pedagogical approach that some faculty are taking, not just in landscape architecture, but in other fields too. We'll ask a student to write a paper and then ask them, using ChatGPT to generate an AI version of that paper and then compare them and say, what's different about this AI generated paper versus yours? But I mean, that's a really cool idea to do that in a design studio as well. Thanks.
that's your new paper.
Yeah.
Okay. I think the possibilities for after this to talk one to Blake, but give him a round of applause.